Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to University Conference Services for hosting today's webinar. And appreciate the introductions as well, Kelly. We've got our pictures and a little bit of our bios up on the screen as well so that you can put a face to the voice and to the names. As Kelly mentioned, this is Michael Clark. I'm a Director and Consulting Actuary with PSolve, which is a division of the River and Mercantile Group, and I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I'm joined by my colleague, Kevin Morrison. Kevin, if you want to quickly introduce yourself as well so that folks can hear your voice.
Definitely. Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. This is Kevin Morrison. As Kelly had introduced, I'm a Director and Consulting Actuary here at PSolve, and I also co-lead the actuarial practice. It's great speaking to everyone today.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks again to everyone for joining us today. Our firm is a pension risk management firm with actuaries like myself and Kevin, as well as investment professionals, and we focus a lot on how we help pension plans, especially those that are moving or have the goal to eventually get to plan termination. Traditionally, the focus of pension plan termination has been on the actual termination process itself. That process can last anywhere from 12 to 24 months from start to finish, with the ultimate finish being paying out benefits either to participants via a lump sum or to an insurer via an annuity purchase. Past that, it can go even longer once you factor in PBGC and possible IRS audits that normally accompany the post-termination process. Plan termination is a fairly regimented process consisting of filings and notifications with required timelines that have to be followed. What we're going to focus our comments on today, however, is how you should appropriately prepare your plan to get to a point where you can start the termination process and be confident that you'll get through the actual termination process smoothly. We've broken the plan termination preparation process into 4 pillars. The first pillar that we're going to address today is funded status, and what we mean by that is, are there sufficient assets to pay potential lump sums and purchase annuities from an insurer at the end of the termination process. We'll then talk about funded status risk, understanding, monitoring, and adjusting the risk that the funded status could dramatically change during that process. We'll then talk about plan administration, including streamlining the plan's documentation, which includes benefit provisions, and ensuring that there's compliant election packages and processes that are in place to document those elections. And lastly, we'll talk about data quality. This can be one of the hardest areas to prepare for termination, and we'll talk about what data is needed and why. But first, we'll talk about funded status. For many plans, this is the sole focus for determining if a plan is ready to terminate. And as you'll see in today's webinar, funded status is important, but it's not the only thing to worry about. You've probably seen a number of different funded status measurements related to your pension plan, whether it's minimum funding liabilities, accounting liabilities, the AFTAP, what shows up in the 5500. The funded status on a termination basis is probably a metric that's not routinely calculated by your actuary, and even less so reported. The ultimate termination liability for a pension plan depends on a number of different factors, including plan design complexity, which Kevin will address later on in the webinar, as well as lump sum window results and annuity purchase rates. As part of the termination process, most plan sponsors will offer a lump sum to active invested terminated participants. For everyone that doesn't ultimately elect a lump sum, including those that are currently in pay retirees, you'll end up purchasing an annuity for them from an insurer. The ultimate termination liability will be highly dependent on how many participants elect a lump sum and how many you end up purchasing that annuity for. In addition to the funded status, pension sponsors also will want to understand the other balance sheet and P&L implications of termination. Most, if not all, plans currently have net losses on their balance sheet related to their pension plan that sit out in accumulated other comprehensive income. If they were to terminate today, that amount that's sitting out there would have to be recognized in the P&L. And for a lot of plan sponsors, they don't like that the sizable P&L recognition that they would have to that they would have to run through the P&L. And so they'll start looking for strategies in advance of plan termination that can help minimize that impact when you actually get to termination. We've actually seen some plan sponsors delay termination, even if they're well funded, to deal with this particular issue. Let's look at an example, though, of how to calculate your pension plan termination funded status. The biggest unknown variable in the ultimate termination cost is the percentage that elect a lump sum distribution, as I mentioned on the prior slide. In this table, we've laid out 3 scenarios for our example plan. In each of these scenarios, we've estimated the liability for actives, vested terminated participants, and retirees under a couple of different assumptions as far as the lump sum take-up rate for actives and vested terminated participants. For each of these scenarios, we've estimated a market value of assets of $18.1 million, and then we've calculated the shortfall. The shortfall, the difference between the estimated termination liability and that market value of assets, is essentially the amount that you would need to put into the plan to fully fund an annuity purchase or those lump sum benefits when you get to the end of that termination process. The first scenario that we've shown here assumes that all of the active and vested terminated participants elect a lump sum. That estimated termination liability for our example is $20.1 million, resulting in a shortfall of $2 million, meaning that the plan sponsor would have to pay $2 million more into the plan to settle all of those benefit liabilities at the end of the termination process. On the far right, the third scenario that we've listed here assumes 100% annuities. So we assume that no actives or vested terminated participants elect a lump sum, or that the plan sponsor doesn't offer a lump sum as part of the termination process. The resulting termination liability goes up by $2 million, and the resulting shortfall, or the amount that the sponsor would contribute at the end of the day, goes up to $4 million in total. Now we know that neither one of those scenarios are very realistic. So if we make some assumption about the take-up rate, the lump sum take-up rate for actives and vested terminated participants, we can come up with a pretty good estimate of what we think the ultimate termination liability will be. But because every plan is different, it's important to get an accurate estimate based on your plan's specific characteristics. For the sample that we've listed here, if we assume that 50% take-up rate for actives and vested terminated participants, our estimated termination liability goes to $21 million, and we're left with a shortfall of $2.9 million. As I mentioned at the onset of this section, funded status is important, but it's not the only item to consider. We're going to talk a little bit now about funded status risk. Funded status risk in a plan termination context is the chance that a plan's funded status substantially changes to a level of underfunding or overfunding that is detrimental to a successful plan termination. For example, if you're planning on an estimated contribution of $2.9 million from our example from the last section, but due to changes in funded status, you could end up in a situation where that amount grows to, say, $5 million. And if you're not planning for that, that can be painful as you're going through the termination process and trying to finalize everything. As an example, if we have a plan, similar to what we're showing here, that currently is $20 million underfunded on a plan termination basis, and if we look at the future and project out future funded status measurements over 1,000 different economic scenarios, given the plan's liability and investment characteristics, and look at the potential range of funded status outcomes, that's really how we're quantifying the funded status risk. It's really what's that potential range of funded status results that we could end up with. For a plan that's closed or that is close to fully funded today, that range of potential funded status at the end of the termination process needs to be relatively predictable, unlike the example that we've shown here that has a range ranging from anywhere of being underfunded by as much as $90 million to being overfunded by as much as $55 million. We'd want that range of outcomes to be much tighter than this. You don't want to be in that situation where you need to make final payouts only to find out that you have to make a contribution in excess of what was planned. You also don't want to end up in a situation where you're too overfunded, as you might not be able to get all of the surplus returned back to you. Over the next few slides, we're going to look at ways that you can reduce your funded status risk. One way to reduce your funded status risk is through a plan's investment strategy. In general, there are two types of assets in a pension plan. There's those that match the liabilities and those that try to outperform the liability growth. The more assets that are liability matched or invested in a liability matching portfolio, the narrower the range of potential funded status outcomes becomes. As a plan's funded status improves, it's important to allocate more assets to liability matching assets. That will reduce the overall outcome of what the funded status may be over time. There are many plans that have adopted a liability-driven investment strategy, or LDI, along with glide paths that automatically adjust the plan's allocation to more liability matching assets, the better funded the plan gets. For those plans that don't currently have a liability-driven investment strategy but are working towards plan termination, they absolutely need to have a strategy like this in place as they prepare for plan termination to avoid those unwanted surprises at the end of the day. Another way to proactively reduce funded status risk as part of preparing for plan termination is through liability reduction strategies. The two most common risk reduction strategies over the last 5 years have been lump sum cash out windows and retiree annuity purchases. Lump sum cash out windows are targeted at vested terminated participants, and many sponsors have done one or more of these windows within the past few years. What a window entails is offering these vested terminated participants a limited time opportunity to start receiving their pension plan benefits before they might otherwise be eligible to receive them, and also give them an additional form of payment option in the form of a lump sum. If those participants affirmatively elect the lump sum, their benefits have been settled and they're essentially out of the plan, and you don't have to deal with them now on termination. To implement a lump sum cash out window, you first would want to assess your plan's funded status, as that you do have to be at a certain funding level to be able to implement a lump sum cash out window. Next, you would decide on who to include in the window. You may offer it to a subset of your vested terminated participants, or offer it to all of them. Some companies look at it based on the lump sum amount and determine who they'll offer it to based on the lump sum amount. The next thing, once you've decided on the group, is to amend the plan to actually allow for the window and specify the terms of how long the window will last and the provisions related to it. You'll also want to look to modify your forms and election packages to make sure that you're reflecting the window appropriately. Once you send those packages out, you get them back before the end of the window period. You'd collect and validate those completed forms and then essentially pay out benefits. The other common risk reduction strategy over the last few years has been retiree annuity purchases. These target current in-pay participants, those that are receiving the monthly checks from the plan. And what we do with this strategy is transfer responsibility, including the liability and for all future benefit payments, to an insurer in exchange for an upfront premium. There's lots of reasons why plan sponsors have implemented this type of strategy beyond risk reduction, including PBGC premium savings. Sponsors that have implemented this type of strategy over the last few years, many have started to look at offering or implementing this strategy for a second or third time. To implement a retiree annuity purchase, the first step is usually to look at the distribution of retirees in your plan by benefit amount and deciding on which group that you would like to offload to an insurer. A lot of times these annuity purchases are targeted at those retirees with the smallest annual benefits, as they, from an administrative standpoint, are the most expensive to maintain in the plan. To select the insurer that you will ultimately need to hire a consultant to perform due diligence on the insurers according to the Department of Labor's Interpretive Bulletin 95-1 that lays out a set of criteria to evaluate the insurers on. This is important because the selection of an insurer is ultimately a fiduciary decision. Once you've decided on the insurer, you then transfer the premium to the insurer, and the insurer begins making payments to those retirees. The retirees get the same amount of their benefit in the same form of payment that they had originally elected as part of this as well. So let's look at an example. This particular company that we're going to look at maintains two frozen pension plans that were underfunded. From the period of 2014 to 2016, for a variety of reasons, the company decided to implement a lump sum cash out window and an annuity purchase for both plans. To give you some context on these plans, they originally started with just under 1,700 total participants between the two plans. The other thing that they noted was that their PBGC premiums were starting to escalate substantially, and that was concerning to them. Again, these plans were underfunded. They were trying to develop strategies to put more money into the plan to eventually get to a point where they could terminate. But the plans were still 7 to 10 years away from plan termination. So anything they could do to reduce their funded status risk and reduce administrative cost in the meantime was looked at as beneficial. After implementing these two risk reduction strategies, a few things came to light. One, there was a significant reduction in headcount. The plans went from almost 1,700 participants down to 770 participants, a reduction in headcount of over 50%. Their PBGC premiums now, their projected PBGC premiums, had also substantially been reduced. That was important to them, again, as I mentioned, as they were going to work towards becoming fully funded to be able to reduce those administrative expenses in the meantime, from having less people in the plan and paying less in PBGC premiums. From a funded status perspective, though, before implementing these strategies, a decline in interest rates of 1% would have resulted in a deterioration of their funded status of almost $11 million. After shrinking the overall size of the plan through these two risk reduction strategies, that amount changed and decreased down to $6.8 million. If equity markets were to fall by 20%, there would be a $2 million change in funded status by virtue of implementing these two risk reduction strategies as well. So as the plan continues to improve in funded status, they'll continue to refine their investment strategy to further reduce their funded status risk and minimize even more the change in funded status that would result from a change in interest rates or credit spreads tightening or equity markets falling. It's imperative that plan sponsors understand and manage their funded status risk as they prepare for termination, as well as during the plan termination process itself. And hopefully this has given you a good sense as to the funded status and funded status risk aspects of preparing for plan termination. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kevin to discuss the next two pillars of plan administration and data quality. Kevin?
Great. Thanks, Michael. So Michael touched on the first two pillars, funded status and funded status risk. What I'll touch on are plan administration and data quality. Plan administration is the first of these two key areas that are often forgotten when determining how ready a pension plan is for plan termination. Clearly understanding roles and responsibilities is important as you lay the foundation for good and complete plan administration. The plan sponsor is not only responsible for maintaining a plan document that is compliant with ERISA, but also responsible for administering the plan according to the terms within the plan document. The plan administrator is responsible for running the plan and can be the employer or can be a committee of employees. The role can also be outsourced to a third party, though that third party is only the true plan administrator, capital P, capital A, if designated as a fiduciary under ERISA Section 316. If the third party is not designated as a 316 fiduciary, then the plan administrator responsibility still fully resides with the committee. Though it's important to note that even if the third party is a 316 fiduciary, the committee still will always retain some fiduciary responsibility. So you're never completely free from that fiduciary obligation. The plan administrator's responsibilities include reporting and disclosure, all aspects of paying out benefits to participants, insurance, and also paying plan expenses. So it's extremely important that the plan is administered according to the terms within the plan document, as well as adhering to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, or ERISA, and all subsequent revisions to ERISA. If this is not done, any errors that exist will often get uncovered as part of an audit. And how that happens is plans can either be selected for an IRS or DOL audit before, during, or even after a plan termination. Additionally, the PBGC will perform a post-termination audit on all plans with more than 300 participants and a subset of plans with 300 participants or fewer. So for the most part, most plans are going to go through that PBGC audit after you get to the plan at the end of the plan termination process. The reason why this is a concern is that fixing mistakes after being discovered as part of an audit can be extremely costly and time-consuming, and therefore should be avoided at all costs. Plan administration is governed by the plan documentation and all amendments to the plan document. So to ensure that everything is complete and accurate, we would recommend having all documents reviewed by ERISA counsel. In addition to that, plan sponsors should also maintain all copies of all historical documents, as questions may arise pertaining to specific plan provisions that may have been in effect at some prior date. And having that document that was in effect as of that date is important. So maintaining those historical documents, which may seem outdated, does actually become important and can be crucial if certain questions do come up. Plan sponsors may also elect to file for a final determination letter during the termination process to get that final blessing from the IRS. If you are going to file for this letter, you want to make sure that, or the plan sponsor will want to make sure that that they are completely comfortable with the status of the plan documentation, so that the IRS doesn't find issues that you are not aware of. So while reviewing the plan documentation, plan sponsors should also take a closer look at the benefit provisions that you have within the plan. Prior to starting the plan termination process, plan sponsors may want to remove ancillary benefits that are not protected under ERISA. For example, supplemental benefits or enhanced disability benefits that are not part of those protected benefits within ERISA. These benefits could then either be administered going forward outside of a qualified plan structure, or could be cashed out using corporate assets. Also, redundant or underutilized optional forms of payment may also be removed from the plan. Upon termination, the selected annuity provider, as Michael mentioned, an annuity will be purchased at the end of that plan termination process, and that selected annuity provider will need to continue administering the plan based on the final provisions of the plan. So taking steps to eliminate these ancillary benefits or to reduce the optional forms simplifies the administration for that annuity provider. And what that can result in is more competitive bids and also a lower cost to eventually terminate the plan. In addition, plans that have not yet frozen benefit accruals will need to do so prior to starting the plan termination process. And along with that, timely and complete notices will need to be sent to affected participants in advance of any benefit freeze. So there are numerous other areas of plan administration where errors can occur. But what I'll do is I'll highlight a few more of the more common ones that we have seen in practice. First, benefit election forms should be thoroughly reviewed to ensure that they are complete, include all the various required disclosures, and are consistent with the terms of the plan document. Completed forms that are sent in by your retiring participants should be reviewed to confirm that proper documentation is included. For example, spousal consent if the retiree elects a non-joint and survivor form of payment. In addition, those completed and processed forms should be maintained within the plan files so that they can be provided at any point upon request. Another area where errors can occur is with the timing of payments. So the timing of when participants start their benefits is important, as delays can increase costs or trigger unintended consequences. Suspension of benefits notices should be sent to your active participants in advance of reaching their normal retirement age, if that is allowed by the plan. If not, what happens is late retirements could result in annual benefit increases of 8 to 10% per year that the participant delays retirement beyond their normal retirement age. And if you think of a participant who's age 65, which is the typical normal retirement age, who then delays to age 70, that 8 to 10% per year can actually lead to a very significantly larger benefit amount. Vested terminated participants can be even more challenging, as they are often more difficult to contact for purposes of starting benefit payments. In addition, there's no suspension of benefits notice option for these participants. So any delayed retirement for a vested terminated participant beyond their normal retirement age will automatically increase benefit amounts. More serious problems, including additional taxation, can occur if that delay extends beyond a participant's required minimum distribution date, which is usually April of the year following the year in which a participant turns age 70 and a half. So making sure that those vested terminated participants at the very latest receive that benefit starting on the required minimum distribution date is extremely important. So some of those unresponsive participants are actually missing due to bad address information. I will touch on this topic in the final section, but plan sponsors basically want to make sure that they work with their consultants to monitor for and make any sort of updates to any bad addresses that they might have. So finally, the third area where errors often occur is around domestic relations orders. A domestic relations order, or DRO, is a judicial order that defines how the plan benefit and provisions are split between a participant and his or her divorcing spouse, also known as an alternate payee. The plan sponsor should have a process in place for qualifying these DROs as they are received, and ensure that the DROs meet all of the legal requirements. Once the benefit split has been calculated, the alternate payee in all benefit adjustments, not just to the alternate payee's benefit, but also to the participant's benefit, should be fully reflected within your plan records. Because benefits impacted by a DRO can be extremely complicated to administer, it's important to make sure you maintain all of the required all the related documentation that came in with that DRO, including the calculation of the split and DRO itself. The eventual annuity provider will often request all this information so that they are able to administer the benefits appropriately. So it's critically important for plan sponsors to make sure that the plan is being administered appropriately and that all necessary corrections are made in advance of starting the plan termination process. If this is not done and if errors are discovered during the plan termination process, the best case scenario is that the process will get delayed and maybe you aren't able to complete the termination as quickly as you had initially hoped. The worst case scenario is that the process may actually need to be halted completely. And as you'd expect, that is something you want to avoid, because that will then not only add time to the process, but now you've added additional cost to end and potentially restart the plan termination. The final key area in determining how ready a pension plan is for plan termination is the quality of the actual plan data. And this key area is also often forgotten. So having accurate plan data is important because you will need to provide this information with the notice of plan benefits, and because it also impacts, because of the impact it can have on the annuity purchase process. I'll address both of those items on later slides. The third reason why having accurate plan data is important is to ensure you're working with the correct participant population and using accurate information when calculating your annual liabilities and also estimating your termination costs, similar to the estimates that Michael had walked through on that funded status section. Unresponsive participants can go missing when the plan sponsor no longer has accurate information on their location, like I had mentioned earlier. Vested terminated participants can be the hardest of those to keep track of, especially those that terminated employment many years ago. It's important to obtain accurate address information as the plan will be sending, as part of the plan termination process, will be sending required notices and benefit election forms to participants. You not only want to make sure those notices are getting to everybody, but when you send those election forms, especially since those election forms will often contain a lump sum option, you want to make sure those forms are getting in front of the participants and they have the option to view the information and also make an election on that benefit or potential lump sum. Plan fiduciaries are obligated to make reasonable effort to locate missing participants or beneficiaries. We mentioned here on the slide DOL Field Assistance Bulletin 2014-1. What that outlines is the 4 minimum required steps that a fiduciary must follow before you can abandon efforts in finding a missing participant. And these 4 steps are listed here on the slide: the certified mailings, checking plans and employer records, checking with a designated beneficiary, trying to contact to see if you can get the correct address information that way, or even using free electronic search tools. Plan sponsors will want to work with their consultants for guidance not only around these minimum required steps, but also to determine if additional searches should be employed, which could incur costs. For example, using like a commercial locator service to get potential address information on any of these missing participants. If a participant remains missing at the end of the plan termination process, the plan does have the option to send that participant to the PBGC, and the PBGC will administer that participant's benefit going forward. However, this approach is more complicated and it also can result in additional costs. So most plan sponsors actually try to avoid this if at all possible. Once again, showing the importance of trying to get these addresses in advance. So some of those missing participants that I was just talking about may actually be deceased participants, and you just don't realize it. There are steps that plan sponsors can take to try to find these potential deceased participants. So many trustees perform periodic death audits for your in-pay participants, so the participants that are actually receiving benefits, but not all do. So plan sponsors should reach out and confirm that that's actually being done. The main reason being is you want to make sure that benefits are being administered correctly. If a retiree dies, you want to make sure the benefit is turned off as quickly as possible, so that you don't have to try to recover benefits or overpayments that were made after the death occurred. What's often overlooked in this process, though, is performing these similar audits on your vested terminated participants and also on beneficiaries of your in-pay participants who are receiving a benefit with a survivor feature. So finding death for these individuals not only help to make sure that you're administering the plan appropriately, but also reduces liability and the eventual plan termination cost. For your fully frozen plan, so if you've frozen benefits for all of your participants, final accrued benefits should have been calculated as of the freeze date, and documentation should be available on those calculations and those participants. However, we often find that this documentation is either not always complete or it's not always in the plan sponsor's files. And at times, relying on a third party to maintain this documentation can actually be very risky, especially if you end up changing from different third parties to which you might be outsourcing some of the administration duties of the plan. Trying to recreate the calculation of that accrued benefit and or obtaining historical pay or service information can often be very challenging, especially in those instances where the freeze maybe occurred many years ago, 5, 10, 15 years ago. Going back and trying to dig out that information often involves paper files and digging through cabinets, and isn't always as successful as you would hope. So having complete information becomes even more important when compiling the Notice of Plan Benefits that I referred to earlier. And this notice is provided to all participants as part of the plan termination process. For your active, your vested terminated, and also your recently in-pay participants, the notice also must show the historical pay that was used to calculate the participant's accrued benefit, if it's a pay-based plan, the service calculation, and any other benefit features that went into the calculation of the benefit. What the notice provides is it gives participants the opportunity to review the benefit amount and also review all of the supporting data that went into that benefit amount. If any issues are then discovered upon that review, participants are encouraged to contact the plan sponsor. So if you have errors or issues with your benefits or your data, this can lead to more participants contacting the plan sponsor. This can also lead to potential participant unrest. So having complete and accurate information is crucial to make sure you avoid those situations. So finally, the level of data accuracy and completeness can also impact the annuity purchase price and your transition to the eventual annuity provider. Insurers are going to need additional data that isn't typically in the annual valuation data that you might maintain. This includes not only data on beneficiaries, name, social security number, but also information on check payments, for example, tax withholdings, and also bank information, for example, with direct deposits. That type of information annuity providers are going to look for as part of the transition. Annuity providers so when annuity providers are providing a quote in this final annuity purchase that Michael had referenced in some of the earlier sections, what the annuity providers are trying to do is determine how much and for how long they will be paying benefits to annuitants. And to do so, they're going to base these estimates on, and their eventual quotes, on many different factors as I've listed here. This includes whether or not the annuitant is a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker or potentially somewhere in between, the benefit amount, the form of payment, and any other benefit complexities, the age and gender of the annuitant, and also where the annuitant currently resides. So if where you have situations where information is missing, what the annuity providers will do is they'll apply appropriate, yet often conservative, assumptions around what that information might have been. So having as much information as possible is very important for part of this process. So providing this complete or as complete and accurate data as you can ultimately lead to more accurate pricing and also result in a smoother transition to the selected annuity provider. Additional data that helps indicate blue-collar versus white-collar workers, such as location, job description, final salary can help as well. Providing that can also lead to more rigorous pricing. Having clean and complete data in advance also expedites that transition process at the end of the plan termination. So while looking at like a data cleanup project may seem onerous and time-consuming, the eventual cost and time savings that result from completing the project makes all of that effort completely worthwhile. It will be much easier to implement a cleanup project now than it will be in future years, or even trying to do the cleanup project during the plan termination process. So tackling these issues and reviewing the data is extremely important now, and not potentially delaying, where that delay can make that task more onerous and more challenging. So with that, I will pass it back to Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So hopefully what we hope that everyone has gotten out of today's webinar is that preparing for a successful plan termination can require a lot of different aspects. It's more than just making sure that the plan is appropriately funded, but there are the other aspects that we talked about as far as funded status risk, making sure that the administration is tight and clean, and making sure that the data is all available. We've worked on a number of cases where a plan has come to us and said, all right, we think we're ready to terminate. Can you help us through the termination process? And we've taken those on only to find out that there was corrections that needed to be made to their plan administration that involved legal counsel. The data that was required was not readily available and needed to be dug up, and accrued benefits needed to be calculated, as Kevin mentioned. And it ended up taking something where the plan sponsor thought they were going to be able to start that 12 to 24-month plan termination process, and pushed it out at least a year just to get things in the right shape that they needed to be in to start the termination process itself. So there's a lot that goes into it, and there's a lot that can be done up front to ensure that when you actually do get to the point of terminating, that can actually be a very smooth and clean process, and that you won't end up with surprises when you get down the home stretch and end up having to fund up to whatever the eventual termination cost is, and that you can feel very comfortable about passing any audits that might come your way from the PBGC and potentially the IRS. So with that, Kelly, I don't know if we've had any questions come in during the webinar that we could address.
We have, Michael. Thank you. Real quick, just a reminder, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available on our website probably by tomorrow afternoon, and also on PSolve's links or website. A couple of the other questions that have come in. How can I find out if my plan is on a good path to get to plan termination?
No, that's a great question, and it's one that we work with our clients on, and as we're out there talking with other plans in the marketplace. One thing that we've been doing to help plan sponsors recently is putting together what we call a plan termination readiness assessment, where we'll actually focus on these 4 pillars that we've discussed today and really dig in and come back to the plan sponsor with a report that shows just how ready they are, from a funded status perspective, from a risk perspective, plan administration, and data quality. Usually what comes out of that analysis is a list of to-dos that the plan sponsor needs to take care of before they can actually start that plan termination process. So working with the provider to understand just where you're at in each of these 4 categories becomes extremely important in understanding, just how ready a plan is to terminate. Kevin, anything that you'd add to that?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add there is just that we often see it kind of both ways, where you might be talking to a client who says, who thinks, coming into the conversation that they're 5, 6, 7 years away from termination, and they may just be thinking about funded status, where maybe it's not quite as large of a plan termination target as they're expecting, and sometimes we may discover that, well, actually, there are certain steps you could take over the next couple years where maybe you're only 3 years out from termination. And then sometimes the opposite occurs, like Michael was saying, where a plan is fully, is very well funded, and that's really the only criteria they're thinking about. And when we dig into the plan administration or dig into the actual data, we find a number of issues that really need to be cleaned up in advance of even starting that plan termination process. So what they thought was maybe a year or a year and a half out before they'd be completely done with this, maybe extends by another year on top of that.
Okay, great. Another question we've had come in: what are the biggest issues you've seen with plan administration in pension plans, I assume?
Yeah, so Yeah, I'll start with that one as well. We've surprisingly the plan administration issues I think tend to be some of the bigger issues that we run across. And as Kevin mentioned, as we discussed the plan administration pillar of termination preparation, I think one of the big items that we see plan sponsors have trouble with is around missing participants, and especially those that are beyond their normal retirement date. It becomes very difficult to track those people down, and plan sponsors, most plan sponsors, I think, don't have a process for making sure that they're following up and have good addresses on file for all of their vested terminated participants. I think that's a big issue that we've seen. Another one that we've run across, it usually relates to the documentation aspect of election forms. So as we look at, for example, a retiree, if we look at their paperwork, maybe they've been in pay for 5 years, and if they elected a form that required spousal consent, was the appropriate spousal consent included in the distribution election paperwork? A lot of times we run across people that are very well-meaning in how they're administering these plans, but let's face it, there's not a lot of people with pension plan administration experience anymore, and because of that, we end up with people who, while well-intentioned and well-meaning and are doing their best, may miss some things as they're administering the plan on a day-to-day basis. Kevin, anything that you've potentially seen?
Yeah, one other thing that I would add is actually, it's more because it's probably one of the more surprising items, is just around the accrued benefit and having sort of backup to that accrued benefit calculation. We've had sort of a lot of discussions with plan sponsors where we ask them this is sort of a fairly simple question of do you have are your accrued benefits final and certified? And as you start, and usually the answer is yes, of course. We froze 10 years ago, and benefits were calculated, and everything's final. And then as you start digging a little bit more, you realize that, well, actually the benefit amounts that are in the data are really just estimates. And when they go to retire, they actually try to recalculate some of these benefits. However, they're missing some information on some participants, and there's other gaps in there as well. So it's the area where you'd expect probably the least number of or amount of problems, where a lot of times we end up surprisingly find issues there where you potentially have to do some digging to find that backup, to these calculations, or even recalculate the benefits and communicate sort of that final certified benefit amount to the participants so that they know what the benefit amount is and see that all the backup to the calculation.
And that's one thing that we encourage plan sponsors, whether they do their own administration in-house, whether they've outsourced it completely to a third-party record keeper, or whether they rely on their consultants to help them with the plan administration. We always encourage them to make sure that they have copies of those accrued benefit calculations on file in their offices, right? So that's a thing, as you can imagine, switching providers, which happens occasionally. You want to make sure that you own that documentation and that it resides with you so that you can supply it to whoever might be helping you. And that's true, too, if you decide to hire another consultant to help with the plan termination process itself, whether from a strategic standpoint or help with certain aspects of the actual implementation. Having that documentation in-house is extremely important. And that's another thing that we encourage plan sponsors to do, regardless of who they're working with.
Okay, great. We have had a couple more questions come in. The next one is, are lump sum windows and retiree annuity purchases still good risk reduction strategies today?
No, and that's a very fair question. One thing that we look at, especially with lump sum cash out windows, those were very popular over the last 5 years. And the reason they were popular was because there was a little bit of a disconnect between the liabilities that showed up on a balance sheet for a company and the actual lump sum payment amount. In many cases, you would find, due to differences in mortality tables and interest rates, that it could be very advantageous to pay out a lump sum because you'd be paying it out at an amount that was less than the balance sheet liability that you were holding for a participant. Now that the IRS has incorporated the new Society of Actuaries mortality tables into the lump sum, the mandatory lump sum calculation assumptions, a lot of that gap is closed. Now, it still exists from an interest rate perspective, but for example, so far during 2018, given that the interest rates that are used to calculate lump sums typically are from the beginning of the year, and interest rates have gone up so far this year, that would put us in the opposite position where now lump sum payments would be more expensive than the balance sheet liability that you're potentially holding for a participant. So far during 2018, from our perspective, a lump sum window is not a good option, but it's something that plan sponsors should keep an eye on, especially as interest rates change throughout the year. As far as retiree annuity purchases, that is still a very growing and active market. In fact, if you look at just how that market has grown over the last 5 years, it's been almost exponential in terms of the amount of annuities that have been placed with insurers, whether that's through plan termination or these retiree annuity purchases as part of a risk reduction standpoint. And all indications are that trend will continue. So if plan sponsors haven't looked at a retiree annuity purchase, that is low-hanging fruit from a risk reduction and a cost reduction standpoint that all plan sponsors should look at. And the reason why that has become a very popular risk reduction strategy is because the annuity purchase price relative to the balance sheet liability for these benefits has really come into a place where they're very comparable. Usually at this point it's plus or minus 1 or 2% is the only thing that differentiates the annuity purchase price from that balance sheet liability. So it can be a very cost-effective way to reduce risk within the plan by annuitizing some of those existing retirees and getting them out of the plan now. Now there's considerations with that as well as it relates to timing. You wouldn't, for example, want to do a retiree annuity purchase if you felt like you were within a couple of years of plan termination. That might not make sense for a variety of reasons. The first and foremost being that on plan termination, the insurers like a combination of immediate and deferred annuities, and so you don't want to offload all of your immediate annuities through a risk reduction strategy if you feel like you're close to plan termination. Kevin, any thoughts on these as well?
Yeah, just specifically, I mean, I think because of the interest rates that Michael had mentioned, how lump sums are usually based on interest rates at the beginning of the year, end of the prior year, and interest rates have increased so far in 2018. The discussion I've been having with a lot of my clients is more been focused around the retiree annuity purchase side for 2018, because that retiree annuity purchase is really going to be, the actual purchase price will really be based on more current interest rates. So it's kind of a one-for-one there, where you're using current interest rates, or current interest rates will impact the pricing that you might get from those insurers, and current interest rates is your most current available information on where your accounting liability might end up. And so the focus has been more around the retiree annuity purchase for this year, but we're continuing to monitor a potential lump sum for next year. So thinking about annuity purchase this year, and then let's just see where interest rates go for the rest of the year. Where mortality ends up for 2019 also impacts how lump sums will look from a cost standpoint in 2019. So it's important to kind of continue to monitor that, because even if it's not a good strategy for 18, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad strategy for 19. So maybe annuity purchase in 18 and thinking about that lump sum next year.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you both so much for your time and all the information you shared today. We're just about out of time. Any last comments or thoughts that you'd like to share to summarize or wrap up, Michael or Kevin?
No, I think, one, we're very appreciative of people spending a little bit of time with us today. Hopefully this has been informative and given people new things to think about as far as how they can take their plans from where they're at today and actually develop a strategy to get them to a point where they can successfully terminate at some point in the future. And again, every plan is going to be different based on the availability of information, the quality of data, just how tight their benefit administration policies and procedures have been, and clearly their contribution and investment strategies as it relates to their pension plans. If anyone does have further questions, we're more than happy to field those Our contact information is listed in the slide presentations, which we'll send out after this as well. But appreciate the opportunity to speak, and appreciate University Conference Services for once again hosting this webinar today.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our attendees who joined us today. If you'd like to connect with PSolve or Michael or Kevin, feel free to join us at one of our 2018 conferences, where Michael will be speaking at each program, next one in New Orleans in May. You can check out our website, where we'll have information about conferences, as well as the recorded webinars, including today's, with links to our YouTube channel. Again, thank you all for being here. Gentlemen, thanks for a fantastic webinar, and hope everyone has a great afternoon. Bye-bye.